Hello, America. I'm Mark Levin. This is Life, Liberty, and Levin. We have a wonderful guest tonight, Senator Mike Lee. How are you, sir?
Doing great, thank you.
It's good to see you.
Thank you.
Now, Senator Lee, you have quite a background. First of all, your father served in the Reagan administration. What did your father do in the Reagan administration?
My dad was the Solicitor General under Ronald Reagan during his first term in office. He was the federal government's chief appellate advocate before the Supreme Court, representing the Reagan administration in front of the justices. I used to go with him. That's sort of where I started to become interested in government. I would go with my dad when he argued in court. Initially, it was just a good way to miss school. But over time, I started understanding what was happening, and I enjoyed it. I found it fascinating.
Rex Lee
Yes.
was your father's name. But you yourself are quite accomplished. You went to a great law school, and you became a clerk to Associate Justice Sam Alito. How did that happen?
I clerked for Justice Alito, first clerked for a federal district judge named Dee Benson in Salt Lake City.
Who also worked
Fantastic
at the
judge.
Justice Department where I had worked at a time.
And an outstanding human being and great judge and mentor. And after I finished that clerkship, I had a friend who was clerking for then Judge Alito on the Third Circuit. He told me that there was an opening and that I should apply. I submitted an application. I ended up getting the job. So I clerked for him first on the Third Circuit, and then several years later, after he got himself on the Supreme Court, he had me back to clerk for him again.
I didn't know that. So you clerked for him twice.
Twice.
And that's quite a big deal because there's a lot of smart lawyers out there who want to clerk for Supreme Court justices, right?
Yes, and I was really fortunate to get to work not just at the Supreme Court, but for that justice in particular. He's an extraordinary human being. He's got an amazing legal talent, command of the English language, and understanding of the fact that finding the right answer in the law is imperative. And there is such a thing as a right answer, and that you have to go through the effort to find what the answer is. I loved clerking for him every minute of it, both years.
Do the justices get along in private?
Yes. In fact, some of the justices who appear to have the most differing opinions and in fact do reach very opposite conclusions are often really good friends. For example, Justice Scalia and Justice Ginsburg were very close friends. They traveled together, they socialized together, and yet they were at opposite ends of the ideological spectrum within the court. I think that says something, and I think it's also indicative of the fact that one's ideological temperament on the court doesn't necessarily preclude a personal relationship.
You know, a lot has been written about the court, a lot has been written about justices, and sometimes as certain justices got older over the years, their clerks wrote a lot of their opinions. I take it Sam Alito wasn't that way.
No, he was actively involved in the process at every step and was really concerned about making sure that each opinion was his and that it said what it needed to say. He was definitely not phoning it in and definitely actively involved in every decision and every opinion that had his name on it and every opinion that came through the court, whether he was the author or not. Meaning even if it was an opinion assigned to another justice, he wanted to make sure that it was right.
I want to turn to something that's just occurred, and that's this budget process and appropriation process in the United States Congress. Jim Jordan has said that the congressman from Ohio and Freedom Caucus member, that they had 17 hours between the time a 2,200-page bill, which had been written in secret by the leadership, was presented to the House of Representatives, and to vote. And so really nobody, even Evelyn Woods herself, wouldn't have been able to get through that in time. Same thing is happening on the Senate side. As a matter of fact, you weren't allowed to offer amendments. And, you know, just as an American citizen, I look at this. We vote for our representatives to participate in this process. Plus, we would like to participate in this process. There's supposed to be various appropriation bills that we can look at and so forth. What do you make of all this?
2,232 pages. That's how long this spending bill was. It takes a long time even to get the fastest printers to print that out physically. It takes much longer to read 2,232 pages of legislative text than it does a fast-paced novel. And so you're right. Members voting on this don't have a chance adequately to read it, to understand what's in it. Perhaps even more importantly, these words are negotiated in private by a small handful of legislative leaders, to the exclusion of everyone else, meaning most of the American people are effectively disenfranchised from this process because their elected senators and representatives are outside of that room where this small handful of leaders is negotiating this bill in private. By the time it comes out into public, there isn't time to debate it, to discuss it, to amend it, to improve it. There isn't time to receive adequate feedback from the American people. And the members themselves who are being asked to vote on this are themselves not fully aware of what's in it. It's wrong. And it will continue until this process doesn't work. In the meantime, it's kind of nice to be one of those few people in that room negotiating it. You get more powerful every time it happens. But it's really bad for the American people. And it is one of the most deeply disturbing things that I experience as a member of the United States Senate.
And it's confounding because in a republic, you have to wonder, how do you undo this? How do you unravel this? I get these calls on radio all the time. What do we do? What do we do? I'm not sure what we do. We can talk about electing the right people. You know, we think we do elect the right people. We had the Tea Party revolution. We had, majorities now in the House and the Senate, Republican president. And it's my understanding this spending bill, even in percentage increases, is the largest in modern history. Is that right?
Yes. And look, it's the nature of governments. It's the nature of human beings as they accumulate power to want to accumulate more power. When they have access to the ability to do something, it's their tendency to do it if they can. The only way we're going to change this is to make this process, this formula, this barbaric mechanism for funding a $4 trillion government no longer work. It will no longer work when the American people call their senators and representatives and make clear to them they do not want them to vote for a measure that's the result of this kind of product. They certainly don't want to vote for increased spending, especially when they themselves don't know and by design cannot know where the spending is going.
But isn't part of the problem we have some candidates that run for office one way and then they govern another way? And it's very difficult for people who are working all day to get through the clutter, to get through the media, even if there are media reports. So one thing goes on back home and another thing goes on in Washington, D.C. So it's very, very hard to know what to do when you're a voter. Isn't this a bigger problem, the difference between constitutionalism and progressivism? The further we get away from the Constitution, the more unmoored from the Constitution, the more government centralized, as you've written about extensively and so forth, the more this is going to occur.
Yes, without question. The only reason that our republic has survived, the only reason our country has thrived as it has, the reason that we have fostered the development of the greatest civilization the world has ever known under the Constitution has been that to the degree we've followed the Constitution, it has kept our government focused on what government can do, what government is uniquely empowered to do, what this particular government is supposed to be doing, and which part of our government is supposed to be acting in which way. The minute we come untethered from that, especially from any of the structural protections in the Constitution, the vertical protection that we call federalism, which says most of the power is supposed to remain with the people at the state and local level, or the horizontal protection we call separation of powers, saying that we're going to have one branch that makes the laws, one branch that enforces them, and another that interprets them. When we drift from those principles, it becomes very, very difficult to contain that power, to contain the compulsory power of government that takes money away from people. It takes months out of people's work year just to sustain it. That becomes a problem. That's why we've got to reorient our national political discourse, our dialogue, on constitutional principles. This does not have to be a partisan issue. In fact, it's not. The Constitution is politically neutral.
And yet, in this context, the modern-day Republican Party, is it a constitutional party? What does the modern-day Republican Party stand for?
The Republican Party purports to be the party of constitutionally limited government and doesn't always govern itself as such. That does have to change. If it doesn't change, the Republican Party is going to lose its mojo. It's going to lose its ability to influence voters and to garner votes. And so I think that is the only answer, not only for our country, but also for the Republican Party. I think there is a big opportunity here to make a change, to make a difference. You talk about the fact that sometimes people will run on one platform and then govern differently, not perhaps casting votes in the same style that they had portrayed themselves as candidates. I think it can help to have a name for certain procedures that people recognize as being contrary to the political governing philosophy of a constitutionalist. And I think this 2,232-page omnibus spending bill will help us give a word to that. And I'm hopeful that...
What's the word?
The word here could be omnibus. We could call it the March 2018 omnibus package. Once people remember that, remember how high the stack of papers was, remember the fact that it was negotiated in secret by a small handful of legislative leaders to the exclusion of everyone else, maybe that will make a difference, and maybe they'll communicate that, whether through their votes or their phone calls or a combination of the two.
Let me ask you this. I've asked almost every guest I've had. I would argue we're not really so much a representative republic anymore with this massive bureaucracy. Most of the laws aren't made by you folks. I would argue we're not really a federal republic anymore, given the centralization of government and the states that live at the behest now of the federal government, even though they created the federal government. And I would argue we're less and less a constitutional republic for reasons like this budget bill and so forth. What are we?
We are a nation of people that purports to operate under the rule of law. And our governing law, the Constitution, says that we are a federal republic and that we have power that's dispersed among the people, that it's kept close to the people. We don't always live up to that. So, yeah, you're right. We've deviated dangerously from the vertical protection of federalism and the horizontal protection of separation of powers. That doesn't mean that that has changed the nature of what our government is supposed to be. And it certainly doesn't change the fact that each officer of this government has sworn an oath to uphold, protect, and defend that very system with this series of structural protections designed to protect the American people from the dangers associated with the excessive accumulation of power in the hands of the few. We can still do this. It is still the law of the land in America that we have these protections. We can restore them. We just have to do it. And that's where voters come into play.
Mm-hmm. How are we doing in this regard?
Not very well. We're doing better, I think, today in many respects than we were a couple of years ago. I think this administration has done a great job of taking out more regulations than it has put in. Their commitment to the 2-to-1 rule, for every regulation that's added, 2 need to be taken out, is going well. I think it's laudable, and I think it really helps to restore this horizontal protection of separation of powers. See, what's happened is since the New Deal era, since basically the 30s, Congress has been passing laws as platitudes. We hereby delegate to Agency X the power to make good law in Area Y. And they can make that law and enforce that law entirely within this executive branch bureaucracy. That's wrong. The Trump administration sought in promising to drain the swamp, to reduce the power of the administrative bureaucracy, and I think it's made good progress. I think we need to make a lot more progress on that front and on the federalism front. You don't hear as often as you should that the fact that certain things are not federal issues. In fact, most things are not. The 10th Amendment makes that clear, just as the text of the original Constitution also made that clear. Most power is reserved to the states, and we should therefore never start any political discussion with the assumption that if there's a law that needs to be made, it needs to be made by Congress. Most of the time, that's not the case.